At stake today, nothing less than the very future of Ukraine and America's standing in the world. Because the meetings with European leaders happening at the White House right now as we come on the air stand to potentially reshape the global order for better, or depending on how things go, for worse. At the moment, there is a multilateral meeting underway in the East Room with a number of European leaders in attendance. They are essentially there as backup for Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, following that travesty of an embarrassment, the ambush on Donald Trump's part back in February of President Zelensky earlier this year. Earlier today, though, Donald Trump and President Zelensky appeared together in the Oval Office. Trump largely behaved himself. That counts as news. He did, though, either wittingly or unwittingly make some news. It had to do with the necessity for a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Listen to what Trump had to say on the topic throughout last week and how something seemingly changed on that topic this afternoon.
It's going to be a good meeting, and we'll go a step further. We'll get it done. I'd like to see a ceasefire very, very quickly. I want to see a ceasefire rapidly. I don't know if it's going to be today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to be, I won't be happy if I walk away without some form of a ceasefire. I don't think you need a ceasefire. You know, if you look at the 6 deals that I settled this year, they were all at war. I didn't do any ceasefires. And I know that it might be good to have, but I can also understand strategically why, well, you know, one country or the other wouldn't want it. You have a ceasefire and they rebuild and rebuild and rebuild, and, you know, maybe they don't want that. But if you look at the 6 deals that we made peace and you know, long-term, long-running wars, I didn't do any ceasefires.
It's not just one country that wants a ceasefire. It's Vladimir Putin's Russia. So all of a sudden, a ceasefire? I don't do ceasefires. We don't need those. Then about an hour ago, Donald Trump shared this news on a key piece of any negotiations: security guarantees for Ukraine.
The Alaska summit reinforced my belief that while difficult, peace is within reach, and I believe that in a very significant step, President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key points that we need to consider, and we're going to be considering that at the table also, like who will do what, essentially. I'm optimistic that collectively we can reach an agreement that would deter any future aggression against Ukraine, and I actually think there won't be. I think that's even overrated, largely overrated, but we're going to find out. And I think that the European nations are going to take a lot of the burden. We're going to help them, and we're going to make it very secure.
Of course, everybody at the White House today, vast majority of Americans, vast majority of Ukrainians want peace for Ukraine. The real rub, though, at least for the U.S., is how we get there. In one possible scenario, America stands proudly with her allies, working in coordination with like-minded democratic nations to apply pressure on Russia, the aggressor, the instigator of the war in Ukraine, lest anyone involved forget that. In another, the U.S. moves toward Russia and more fully embraces the aggressor and the instigator, advocating for Russia's desired position, Russia's desired concessions from Ukraine, against the wishes of some of our allies who came to our aid, not for nothing, in the aftermath of September 11th, as our NATO allies, without question. It's worth noting that ahead of today's meetings, after Donald Trump met with Putin on Friday, Russia was seemingly militarily, at least, emboldened, launching a deadly assault on Ukrainian cities near the borders, including Kharkiv. Ukrainian officials say 10 people died in those attacks. This live and ongoing and still deadly, for the Ukrainians at least, geopolitical fork in the road is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, MSNBC International Affairs Analyst, Ambassador Michael McFaul is back with us. Also back with us, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Mark Hertling's here. And rounding out our group, former Democratic Senator, MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill is here. Ambassador McFaul, I'll start with you. Just on what we've laid out, where are your thoughts, where are your hopes, and where are your fears?
Well, I think last Friday, that Alaska summit was one of the most disastrous summits that I can think of. Did no good in terms of advancing America's interests or the interests of our allies or Ukraine. And we treated this horrible dictator who terrorizes Ukrainians every single night, as you just showed, by killing them through these attacks on civilians. We treated him like he was some special friend of the United States. Today's been a correction to that. There was a good meeting so far, at least the optics. We don't know the substance yet. It's too early to tell. But President Zelensky came. That was smart, whoever's idea that was. And then adding the Europeans, that was a brilliant move. Whosever idea that was, if that was somebody on Trump's team, I don't know who it was, but it was brilliant because it set the context into something bigger than just about Trump versus Zelensky. And that just, for Trump, that just reminds him of 2016 and impeachment. The conversation they just had with the cameras on just a few minutes ago put it in a much wider context. And secondly, began to correct the framing that Putin had trapped the president into on Friday. This notion that we can't have a ceasefire until we have a full agreement. Where in the diplomatic books does it say that? I've been a diplomat and I've studied diplomacy, all hundreds of years of American diplomacy. I studied for my last book. There's no rule book that says that. That was a Putin line, just as you were discussing. I'm glad, especially the chancellor from Germany said we can revisit that. And then secondly, talking seriously about security guarantees that might include European soldiers in Ukraine. That is progress. I would like it to be a NATO security guarantee rather than a NATO light security guarantee. But if you have to settle for something, that's much better than no security guarantee at all. I saw that was progress. The hard part, of course, comes when we get to the issues of territorial land swaps or where the lines will be. But this was a little bit of progress today.
Let me play Donald Trump on that topic of exchanging territory.
We also need to discuss the possible exchanges of territory, taking into consideration the current line of contact. That means the war zone, the war lines that are pretty obvious, very sad, actually, to look at them, and negotiating positions. President Putin.
What does that mean, Ambassador McFaul? Can you translate that for us?
Yeah, well, to the extent I understand President Trump. But when he's talking about exchanges of territory, let's just be crystal clear. He's talking about exchanging Ukrainian territory for Ukrainian territory. He's not talking about Russian territory. He's not talking about Russia leaving, maybe these little pieces up in Sumy, little pieces they might leave. But the big swaps are Ukraine for Ukraine. Moreover, to remind everybody, from Friday, Putin is demanding that Ukraine leave part of Donbass that Ukrainian soldiers currently control. That is his negotiating position right now. And the idea that we would help to mediate that is completely absurd. And so I hope that that will be one of the ridiculous maximalist points of Putin that might be retired after today's meeting, but it wasn't retired in Alaska. It was alive and well on Friday.
And I went in and looked at some maps and tried to remind myself of what the Donbass region is, why it's so bitterly fought over, how much of it Russia controls, how much of it Ukraine controls. Can you just talk me through what is Ukraine's position on any and all of Ukraine's territory?
Well, Ukraine's official position, President Zelensky's official position, of course, is to restore their territorial integrity to their 1991 borders, which includes Donbass, which includes Crimea. All that red you're showing, that should go back to Ukraine. That's their official position. When I talk informally with people in Ukraine, including those close to the president, I think they're ready to concede some control of their territory. They're not going to give it over, but they might agree to this formula, that we will only try to reunite our country through peaceful means as long as we get real security guarantees from the West, from NATO, from our European allies, and from the United States. And that's a formula that I think is the substantive piece that they should be talking about today. And in my view, the talk about land pieces, that should be between Putin and Zelensky, mediated by us, but that's not our conversation. But then the security guarantee part should be between Ukraine and NATO allies, including us, without Putin at the table. The idea that Putin gets to decide what the security guarantees are, I think that would be a big, big strategic mistake. Keep those conversations separate.
Most Americans do not trust Donald Trump on Ukraine. According to Pew, nearly 60% of adults surveyed said they're either not too confident or not at all confident that the president can make wise decisions about Russia's war. Joining us now is former New York Congressman Mondaire Jones and Semafor politics reporter Dave Weigel. Dave, explain to me the politics of Donald Trump's decision-making. How's it going to play?
With Republicans, we've seen that Republican voters follow the president wherever he leads on this. So you saw once he was critical of the war in Ukraine, said he could stop it in a day, which hasn't happened. You saw Republican support for the war falling. You've seen Republican support for funding Ukraine with whatever it needs rising over the last few months as the story fell out of the news. Now, this is not something that Republicans see as a defining election issue, a midterm issue. It's just something that doesn't comport with the president's overall strategy of withdrawing military commitments wherever he can and using military forces to, well, frankly, be in American cities, but also quick strikes that help our allies. So it doesn't. There's not a lot of congruence between what the president ran and what his base likes and what he's doing. It is driven by Russia and its desires and its understanding of how to get what it wants out of the president.
What about what happened on Friday, Dave? Vladimir Putin spoke first at the news conference that wasn't a news conference. No questions were taken. He spoke at length from notes, talking about what he believes he got out of that meeting. Donald Trump winged it after that, said almost nothing, but was very congratulatory toward Vladimir Putin, tried to flatter his aides who were sitting there in the front row, and didn't come away with anything. I mean, he walked in there saying he was going to try to work out a ceasefire, and if he wasn't going to get it, he would walk away. But it seemed like, I mean, even Fox News said it appeared Donald Trump got steamrolled. So if Fox News is coming out and saying, what the heck is going on here, how does that affect voters?
Well, two things from the meeting. One, Putin does seem to have, I wouldn't say put the idea in the president's head, but reminded him to say something and do something about states that allow mail voting. So this came up, and the president put out a Truth Social post about it, and Republicans and Democrats are in their ways reacting to it today. And on the second part, when I talk about the Russians have a good understanding of what Trump wants to do, he is in a sort of campaign, an ad hoc campaign for a Nobel Peace Prize. The White House puts out messaging about it all the time. You could look at the calendar for October when there's going to be an announcement here. If the Russians look at what Trump is doing and say, you can draw this out because what he's interested in is something to take to Norway and get credit for, that's pretty astute. It's not clear what the demand, from preventing World War III is the one consistent Trump demand we've heard here, which was being prevented long before he took office. Otherwise, the Russians don't have any domestic concerns. They have Trump-related concerns, and they figured out what to do about them.
Vladimir Putin and the relationship with Donald Trump has always been kind of a head-scratcher, and Democrats have run on this, on the confusion of it. They've said, why is Donald Trump so flattering toward Vladimir Putin? What the heck was going on in 2016? You heard Donald Trump bring up 2016 again, even standing next to Vladimir Putin on Friday. How did Democrats take what's happening right now, both Donald Trump appearing next to Vladimir Putin, rolling out the red carpet for him, and these negotiations, which so far have not borne any fruit, for a ceasefire or an end of fighting in Ukraine?
Democrats have never won an election over the issue of the Ukraine-Russia war. It is something that has now for years been deeply unpopular, actually, among the American people. And so it's so interesting that Donald Trump, who took this issue and made it a popular one for him on the campaign trail, saying that he would wind this war down and stop sending so much money over to Ukraine in this, what he would say anyway, an endless war, has now squandered something that he had a competitive advantage on. Now, taking a step back, this war is really important for us to side with Ukraine on. I mean, all this president had to do was continue on the trajectory of what Democrats in Congress like myself and then President Biden supported, facilitated, which was and has been a war that Ukraine has defied expectations in. I mean, how many people predicted that the war would end like this? And now here we are years later. You know, I remember going on a congressional delegation to so many different countries, rallying support for our effort in Ukraine, making sure that we can beat back the ambitions of a madman who would like to not just stop at Ukraine, but to go into Poland and to restore the Soviet order. This is a direct challenge to the national security and geopolitical interests of the United States.
Do Democrats stand up and say that, or do they just let this issue pass? Is this, as you said, it's not a winning issue. It's not something that people are really paying attention to.
I think it's turning into a winning issue. When you look at the way that this polling has shifted, Americans, for the first time, or outside of the Democratic Party anyway, are scratching their heads and saying, why would we facilitate Ukraine giving up any aspect of its territorial integrity, like any part of this country, to a villain named Vladimir Putin? And they see this president fail to fulfill his promise in terms of winding this war down. And so I think this is a good issue increasingly for the Democrats, but it's not going to win the 2026 elections.
Do they touch what he just said about the next elections? He's talking about mail-in voting, yeah, but he made a joke about being in a war in 3.5 years. And I guess if we're in a war, I guess I don't have to have an election.
Yeah, look.
And there's growing concern that Donald Trump will try to stay in office past his constitutional 2-term limit.
Yeah, when has he ever, shown an interest in abiding the Constitution? We got to get through 2026, and there is a redistricting war underway, something that I know well, given my own experience here in New York back in 2022. Let's see whether Republicans are able to gerrymander their way into the majority again in 2026, despite all of the unpopularity of their policies. So I think it's why you see Gavin Newsom increasingly become a leader in the Democratic Party on this, because he's one of the few people actually fighting back against this administration. Understand, you got to fight power with power, and not, with one hand tied behind your back, or, this woe is me mentality when you're trying to use a playbook that has long been eviscerated since 2016.
Gavin Newsom's Twitter feed is something to behold right now. Mondaire Jones, thank you very much. Dave Weigel, thank you as well.
People showed up in big numbers in Austin, Texas today, cheering Texas Democrats as they returned to the state amid a huge Texas fight that has huge national implications. Texas has been at the center of this extraordinary demand by President Trump that Republican-controlled states like Texas should draw new congressional districts in an effort to effectively guarantee Republican control of Congress for years to come. And it really is not just Texas. Vice President J.D. Vance flew to Indiana last week to put pressure on the Republican governor there to also rig the Indiana maps for the Republicans. Politico reports that the White House has been talking with Republicans in Missouri and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Florida to try to get those states to all rig their congressional maps as well. So that's one thing he's trying, demanding changes to congressional district maps to essentially make it structurally impossible for Democrats to control Congress again, using Republican-controlled states to do it. That's one thing he's trying. Here's a second thing he's trying. Trump also appears to be trying to sort of establish a pretext for nullifying or delaying or not paying attention to the results of the midterm elections everywhere next year. He's doing this by demanding a new census, saying the old census shouldn't count. Now, the census and elections might sound like different things, but the census is how we get congressional districts. And if Trump can effectively nullify the existing census by blaming the counting of immigrants or something, By doing so, he will lay the ground for claiming that all the existing congressional districts in this country, which all only exist because of that census, he's laying the groundwork for claiming that those congressional districts are all somehow bad and they can't be used, and therefore we can't have congressional elections using the congressional districts that we thought we have. So that's two. It's another thing that he's trying. Well, now there's a third. Trump has a new idea for bollocksing up the midterm elections. And it's an idea that he says he got from his best friend, the guy he once said he wanted to be his best friend. On Friday, President Trump held a summit in Alaska with Vladimir Putin. Immediately after that summit, Trump said Putin gave him some advice on how to conduct elections here in our country. Trump said Putin says that people shouldn't be allowed to vote by mail. He says he got that idea from Putin. And so today, Trump says that he will sign an executive order barring Americans nationwide from voting by mail and potentially banning voting machines as well. Now, I would caution you, again, as always, to watch what he actually does here and not just what he says he is going to do. But if Trump is essentially taking tactical advice from the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin about how to hold something that looks like an election but isn't actually an election, as an answer to the existential question for American democracy, this is a little bit on the nose, right? Here's how historian and journalist Garrett Graff summed up what's at stake. He wrote today, quote, "This is step one on how we lose free and fair elections. It's not that Trump will cancel the midterms. It's just that everyone has to vote in person, and urban downtowns will be filled with ICE checkpoints and intimidating National Guard troops to, quote, double check that only citizens vote." Will we retain the right to replace our leaders by election? Joining us now is Garrett Graff, journalist, historian, and author of the brand new book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb. Mr. Graff, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let me ask, first of all, about the sort of premise that I just laid out there in my introduction. I feel like I'm seeing three different lanes, three different tactics by which Trump is trying to call into question the normalcy and to sort of change expectations around the 2026 midterms. Do you think that's fair? Do you disagree?
I absolutely agree. And I think that what you're doing is key to understanding this, which is I think too often we think of sort of Donald Trump being crazy over here, being crazy over here, and being crazy over here, and that they're not related to some sort of larger plan or effort. Whereas I think what we are seeing is this roadmap for how our country loses free and fair elections, which is I have never been one to believe that, Donald Trump's going to cancel the midterms or cancel the 2028 presidential race. Russia, as we know, has elections. Saddam Hussein was elected head of Iraq when he was dictator there. Instead, what I think we are watching is subtle and not so subtle efforts by Republicans across the country, including in the White House, to change who gets to vote, how they vote, and subtly shape the electorate for 2026 and 2028 such that Republicans can lock in an illegitimate minority rule.
That, of course, proceeds in parallel with Trump's years-long effort to try to normalize the questioning of otherwise normal election results. So if you are narrowing, as you say, the number of people who can vote and the means by which people can vote, and you have normalized this idea that election results are inherently suspect and shouldn't be trusted if they don't favor Trump and his causes, that stew gets pretty toxic pretty quickly, whether or not elections are canceled. I mean, you get, I guess the question is where you see the line being drawn as to whether or not elections still count as free and fair once you're playing in these sorts of categories.
Absolutely. And I think you also need to fast forward through some of the developments that we're seeing this year. The hiring of 10,000 new ICE officers represents a sort of super empowered professional thuggery in cities across the country where federal law enforcement has been a light, if any, presence. We have armed National Guard troops headed from red states into blue cities right now, just as they did in Los Angeles earlier this spring. You don't need to discourage all that many people voting in all that many places across the country to radically reshape national politics.
Journalist and historian Garrett Graff, I really appreciate your thinking on issues like these and your clarity in the way you bring history to bear on this stuff. Thanks for talking with me about it tonight. I appreciate it.
Anytime, Rachel.
President Trump has leaned into this war and related diplomacy for the last several days. And yet Congress is now keeping Jeffrey Epstein and that scandal in the headlines, even though, of course, it hurts their fellow Republican president. But a key figure who was in charge of the Bureau of Prisons and the Justice Department during Epstein's controversial death and the ensuing scandal over missing videos and all the rest, actually went under oath today, former Attorney General Barr, facing questions from a Republican-led committee. Now, he was subpoenaed along with some other witnesses. What's striking is that even though he has obvious vulnerabilities, indeed, at times he's admitted that mistakes were obviously made at that prison, he has rushed to the front of the list of people testifying. Now, he was the Attorney General, quote, during a time when Epstein was under investigation, the committee notes, and they had said they thought he might have knowledge or information relevant to the probe. And yet here's where things skip a beat, because Republicans want to appear to be investigating this. And yet, in some key ways, they also are now being pulled into a lot of happy talk about how maybe everything's just fine. Because the Republican chair, James Comer, says Barr basically defended Donald Trump and told them things that are consistent with the story they've been telling in public. But you got to go back all the way to 2019 when Barr was in charge, and he said he would look into whatever happened in that now suspicious prison cell death. Now, he admitted, as I mentioned, a perfect storm of screw-ups, and then said he would personally review security footage. And having done that, he said on his authority, his credibility, nobody entered Epstein's cell the night he died. Problem is, Barr said that years ago, and then finally later, selective video was released, but not the most important video, which Barr's DOJ still claims was lost. The video that finally came out in the second term has faced a lot of questions about not only missing material, but inconsistencies that would suggest, CBS among others, that Barr was overstating his conclusions, which is they didn't have enough evidence to rule out whether anyone might have gotten into that cell. I want to be clear. That doesn't mean somebody did go in. It just means that Barr overstated the case. And that raises more questions like, why is a sitting member of the government in a rush to apparently clear what his own Bureau of Prisons did at the time? Why overstate that? But if you remember Bill Barr, you might remember the Barr letter that misrepresented the actual Mueller report and many other ways that he's tried to have it both ways. Meanwhile, the DOJ says it will start turning over more Epstein documents to the Congress this week. We're joined by former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. Welcome.
Hey, Ari.
Nice to have you. We don't have a lot of detail yet about what Barr said. Not unlike the famous Barr letter, we're getting little political snippets. But let's start with the fact that the committee subpoenaed many people, including Eric Holder and President Clinton. Does it strike you as odd or raising questions that Barr rushed in there and they seem to have a very sort of aligned message strategy about whatever happened in there?
Well, someone had to go first, I suppose, and Barr is certainly a witness with knowledge about the relevant time period in the case. It's, I think, very difficult to figure out why, for instance, Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch were subpoenaed, why Hillary Clinton would have been subpoenaed. That feels more like it's about politics than about law. But I agree with you. You know, having Barr first sets the narrative, and the narrative today, based on what we have heard about his testimony, is that Donald Trump did nothing wrong. So yet again, we have Bill Barr standing by his guy, standing up for Donald Trump. And as you point out, during the Mueller investigation, Barr really whitewashed the conclusions of that report in a highly favorable way for Trump when it wasn't warranted. So I think it's appropriate for us to reserve judgment here until we learn more.
And that Bill Barr's opinion of his former boss is, I think, far less probative, far less essential to a thorough investigation than whether he was part of an effort to minimize the open questions there. And I've been very careful to say we don't know what happened. But the original video that was most dead-on view of the door remains missing. So you've got a guy saying, I reviewed the lesser video and I cleared everyone. But if this were a independent, 9/11 style or Warren Commission style review, you'd really want to double check that, because Barr had every reason to want to say that the DOJ didn't do anything really wrong.
So I think that there are two separate issues here. And one is Donald Trump, whether he appears in the Epstein files. Yep. And apparently Barr has said did nothing wrong. But you point out this earlier issue, which I think many people have been unwilling to let go of. The fact that there are missing minutes of video right at the most, I think, significant point in time has led people to have questions about the death of Jeffrey Epstein. Some of the facts involved in, I think, the mathematics, the calculus involved in how he allegedly committed suicide have caused people to have more questions. And so, look, Bill Barr saw all the video, heard from all the witnesses, reached the conclusion that he reached, but perhaps more important than that conclusion would be hearing him explain why he believes it's valid, given the problems with missing evidence that can't be accounted for.
Yeah, and here was Comer now. We'll play that. Take a look.
There have to be a lot of documents. So I'm under the impression that they're gathering all these documents, and that's what the subpoena called for. And I think the administration knows this is what Congress wants, Republicans and Democrats. And I think President Trump has said clearly he wants to, release all the documents. So we're going to get the documents.
Is it odd that Comer is echoing Donald Trump's claim he wants to release documents that he has refused to release? And now they're playing a classic Washington game of saying, well, we'll move them from this building to that building. We'll move them from DOJ to Congress. There are separate real equities questions about how much should be released, as always. But what does it tell you that he's faking it? I don't mean it disrespectfully, but he seems to be faking an investigation where the beginning, middle, and end is repeating Donald Trump is all good.
It feels like some pretty weak sauce, right? The conclusion comes before the evidence is in. And Ari, when I issued a subpoena, I'm not Congress, I was a federal prosecutor, but when I issued a subpoena, I meant for the person receiving it to comply with it in a timely fashion. Here, the Justice Department has had a period of weeks to at least begin compliance. The subpoena's due date is tomorrow. And what we heard from Comer today is, well, maybe the Justice Department will start to turn over documents to us, but it's complicated. Well, that's why you get a little bit of lead time on doing these things, right?
This is how the authoritarians operate. They declare an emergency, and then they think that the rule of law doesn't govern anymore. The Constitution is irrelevant. Well, our Constitution doesn't work like that. We've got the Fourth Amendment for regular times and for emergency times. We've got the Fifth Amendment for regular and emergency times. We got the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Sixth Amendment.
But who's going to force them to follow them, Congressman? We have the amendments are lovely. I like them too. But who, when you're talking about we have these things for emergency times, if President Trump and his administration don't care, if Republican members of Congress are not going to step up and try to stop him, if the courts take so long for these things to happen and to get to the Supreme Court where he threw 3 people on there, who is going to make him actually do it? Who's going to make him follow the law?
But even here, there was a local judge, a Superior Court judge, who explained how the statute actually operates, and they backed off. So they don't claim to be running the police department exactly anymore. I mean, again, as in everything else in Trump world, it's ambiguous and fuzzy. but they backed off the idea that they could just take over the police department. And I think what we've seen is, more than 350 cases being brought against this reign of lawlessness. And we have preliminary injunctions and temporary restraining orders in more than 200 of them. So the justice system is working at that level. The problem is, by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, that's where they start slicing the bologna extremely fine to try to determine things in Donald Trump's favor. But meantime, the district courts and most of the appeals courts are really hanging tough for the Constitution as it's actually written.
Well, while they are hanging tough for the Constitution, Republicans are hanging tough for Donald Trump, which is interesting to me, given that in the past, they have been suspicious of federalization of the National Guard, specifically Kristi Noem. Just take a look at all of these tweets from February of 2024. If Joe Biden federalizes the National Guard, that would be a direct attack on states' rights. January 2024, it would be unprecedented for Joe Biden to federalize the Texas National Guard. February of 2024, Democrats are encouraging Biden to federalize the National Guard, to take that power away from the states. I will always stand to defend states' rights. Well, so much for that. Given that we know where she is now, do you have any Republicans in the House who've signed on to your resolution?
Not as of yet. Of course, we're not back yet, and so we haven't had a chance to have really intense conversations, and we're going to pursue it. And remember, there are some Republicans who've begun to break from Trump orthodoxy on different issues, most notably with respect to the Epstein files, since he pulled a U-turn on that. But we've also seen, like Congressman Massey from Kentucky, who has strong libertarian leanings, siding with the Democrats on behalf of the Bill of Rights. But your point is right. I mean, imagine if Joe Biden had sued ABC or CBS or NBC for $20 billion and then used the FCC to effectuate a shakedown against a particular news media entity in order to fill his pockets. The Republicans would be outraged by it. But this clear First Amendment violation goes completely unremarked by them because it's Donald Trump who's engaged in it.
Yeah, I hear a lot of this, Congressman. But here's the thing I think that really kind of concerns folks, and it really touches on this idea that who's going to actually stand for the people of D.C. right now? You're doing your fight as a Maryland representative. The mayor is trying to navigate the waters very carefully.
We haven't really heard from the delegate.
But you haven't heard from a lot of the officials in this town. You have a lot of Washingtonians in barbershops and parts of this town that a whole lot of members of Congress never venture into because they don't know jack about D.C. All they know is what's on that building behind Alicia. They don't know about the neighborhoods. They don't know about the men and women who raise families here and build community. And yes, it like any city at periods of time have trouble with crime. But they've managed that as a community, and the leadership has stood up. Home rule was put in place in '73 to allow this city and its residents to govern itself. And yet you have people in that building behind Alicia in the Congress who come to this city and think that they can just pity-pat it all over the place. So what are Washingtonians to expect? Who's going to be their voice right now against this jackbooted thuggery by a president who doesn't give a damn about Washingtonians? He's just trying to avoid more conversation about Mr. Epstein, because that's what this is about.
I mean, I think Lord Byron said, he who would be free must themselves strike the first blow. And I think it is people in Washington who've been assembling in rallies and pickets. There's a free D.C. movement. There have, of course, been people fighting for D.C. statehood for a long time, but they've got allies. They've got allies, as you're saying, Michael, in Maryland and in Virginia. Don Byer's been very strong. Senator Van Hollen has been very strong. Senator Also Brooks, who I think was born in D.C., she's been very strong as well. And I think that the whole region understands that oppression of people in Washington hurts everybody who lives in our region. And I know a lot of my constituents in Maryland's 8th feel very strongly about the issue. We don't want to see people's rights being trampled there. And of course, if they set up ICE checkpoints around the city, it means all of my constituents who are traveling into Washington are going to get stopped there. So everybody's constitutional rights are being affected by this, absurd reign. I mean, if you've talked to Mayor Bowser about it, she's asking, well, what are the National Guard's people doing? because there was no real emergency. Remember, the emergency was the Epstein files, but there was no emergency on the streets. So you've got them patrolling the Washington Monument and hanging around Union Station. And all that's fine. But look, if you really want to deal with crime in America, in the big cities and the small towns and the suburbs, because crime exists everywhere, then you've got to listen to the local leaders and ask what's needed. So if you ask the people in D.C., they'll say, give us the $1 billion that's been effectively impounded by Donald Trump and by the Republicans. They want to spend that on police salaries and on law enforcement and on public education. If you listen to local leaders around the country, give us the means to have effective gun control so we can have universal violent criminal background checks around America. That would be far more meaningful than sending National Guardsmen from Mississippi to the District of Columbia to hang around Union Station or, washing off graffiti. Because Trump kept talking about graffiti. I don't know exactly how he plans to attack that. But in any event, all of this is a violation of the American tradition that you don't use the military for law enforcement purposes. And it's either a waste of energy and time or it's dangerous. And as you were saying, the conservatives used to understand that and were emphatic about it, certainly when Joe Biden was president.
Congressman, you've mentioned his name a couple times, Epstein, and so has Michael. Today, the Oversight Chair, James Comer, released this statement on the DOJ, quote-unquote, compliance with the subpoena. I want to read this to you. Officials with the Department of Justice have informed us that the department will begin to provide Epstein-related records to the Oversight Committee this week on Friday. I appreciate the Trump administration's commitment to transparency and efforts to provide the American people with information about this matter.
Deadline was today. Deadline was not Friday.
So they don't blew through the deadline. Right? So they didn't. That commitment to transparency has already been blown through. But also begin to, what should the American people take from that statement? When should they expect to actually see things? What should they expect to see?
Well, what we should expect to see is a complete release of the files. I think what we can expect.
Do you believe that's going to happen?
Well, I think if Congress passes the bipartisan resolution, the Kana-Massey resolution, and we demand it and we enforce it, then yes, we will see it. But if we allow them to stage manage and choreograph this thing like a new Kennedy Center musical performance by Donald Trump and his family, then we're going to have a problem because they're going to show us exactly what they want us to see, and we'll get dribs and drabs and bits and pieces. And, Americans can smell a cover up. And we know everything that happened with Ghislaine Maxwell was, oh, my God, she's being subpoenaed by the Oversight Committee. Let's quickly get to her as fast as possible with Donald Trump's former personal criminal defense lawyer, who then spent hours with her. And then without any other line attorneys with him, any of the people who actually worked on the case. And then he pronounced himself satisfied with her answers. And what do you know? She gets this sweetheart transfer to a minimum security facility in Texas that's considered a club fed, where sex offenders aren't even allowed to be admitted there. And she was able to accomplish that in a couple days. Usually it takes months and months to go through a whole multi-level process before you're transferred. So already this thing smells like a very intense cover-up.